That deal will fail. The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the soft clink of crystal and the low hum of million-dollar conversations. But something about them didn't belong, like a crack forming in perfectly polished glass before anyone could see it spread, and for just a fraction of a second, the room seemed to hesitate without knowing why, as if the air itself had paused to listen. Outside, rain traced slow lines down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private dining suite on the 42nd floor, turning the Manhattan skyline into a blurred painting of light and shadow, while inside, everything was sharp, controlled, deliberate, every detail curated to reflect power, success, certainty, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Harrington, a man who had built a $10 billion empire by trusting his instincts and never, not once, second-guessing a decision. His pen hovered just above the final page of the contract, the ink still wet from the signatures of the executives seated across from him, their tailored suits and measured smiles masking the quiet anticipation of a deal that would shift markets by morning, and Daniel's expression was calm, almost bored, as if this moment, this magnitude, was just another line item on a long list of victories. No one noticed her at first, not really, because people like Clara Whitmore were designed to be invisible in places like this, moving quietly between tables, refilling glasses before they were empty, adjusting silverware that didn't need adjusting, her black uniform blending into the background like a shadow trained to serve without being seen. But her eyes were different, steady, observant, lingering not on the people, but on the paper in front of Daniel, on the fine print that no one else in the room had bothered to read twice. She stepped forward only when necessary, placing a glass of water beside him with a movement so precise it barely disturbed the surface. And that was when she said it, not looking at him, not raising her voice, just a simple statement delivered like fact rather than opinion. That deal will fail. A few heads turned, more out of confusion than concern, and one of the executives let out a short, dismissive laugh, the kind reserved for interruptions that didn't matter. But Daniel didn't laugh, not immediately, because something in her tone didn't match the words. There was no hesitation, no apology, no attempt to soften the impact. And for a man who had spent his life reading people faster than they could read him, that absence was louder than any challenge. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his gaze from the contract and looked at her for the first time. Really looked, taking in the stillness of her posture, the calm in her expression, the unsettling sense that she wasn't guessing, wasn't reacting, wasn't trying to impress anyone in the room. She was simply stating something she believed to be true, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain. Daniel Harrington did something he almost never did. He paused, his pen still hovering, the signature incomplete, the outcome suddenly uncertain. No one in the room spoke, not because they were stunned, but because they were waiting for Daniel Harrington to react. And in rooms like this, his reaction decided everything, the rhythm, the tone, even what counted as reality. And for a brief moment, the only sound was the faint tapping of rain against glass and the distant hum of traffic far below, muted by height and money and insulation. While Clara Whitmore stepped back into stillness as if she had never interrupted at all, her presence shrinking again into the quiet efficiency expected of her role. But Daniel did not return to the contract. He did not sign. He did not dismiss her. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in calculation, the way a man looks at something that does not fit into the system he has spent years perfecting. One of the executives across the table cleared his throat and forced a polite smile, attempting to smooth over the moment, suggesting they continue, reminding Daniel of the timeline, the opportunity, the numbers that had already been agreed upon. But Daniel lifted a single finger, not even looking at him, and the man stopped mid-sentence, because power did not need volume, it only needed certainty. Slowly, Daniel lowered his pen onto the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the contract as if buying himself time, and then he reached for the document again, not to sign, but to turn back a page, his movements deliberate, controlled, almost casual, but anyone watching closely could see the subtle shift, the precision of a man who was no longer following momentum, but searching for something. His eyes scanned the text with the same intensity that had built his empire, line by line, clause by clause, ignoring the impatient glances, the tightening smiles, the unspoken pressure building around him. And then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze slowed. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden reaction, no visible shock, just a pause that lasted half a second too long. The kind of pause that did not belong in a room where everything was supposed to move forward without hesitation. He leaned in slightly, reading the same paragraph again, his fingers pressing lightly against the paper, and something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm changes direction. Across the table, one of the investors adjusted his tie. Another reached for his glass but did not drink, and for the first time since they had entered the room, confidence began to fracture at the edges, not because anyone knew what was wrong, but because Daniel Harrington was no longer certain, and that alone was enough to make everything feel unstable. He flipped to the next page, then back again, tracing a section with his finger as if mapping out a path only he could see, and then, without lifting his head, he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that silenced the room completely. Who drafted this section? No one answered immediately, because the question was not about authorship, it was about accountability, and the delay, even for a second, was answer enough. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a pattern reveals itself too late. And then he did something even more unusual. He glanced sideways, not at the executives, not at the contract, but toward the edge of the room where Clara stood, quiet, composed, already moving to refill another glass as if nothing had happened. And for the first time in years, Daniel Harrington realized that the most important voice in the room had not been sitting at the table. The silence that followed his question did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, each second stretching just long enough for doubt to settle into every corner of the room. And the men who had arrived with polished confidence now sat slightly straighter, their eyes shifting not toward each other, but toward the contract as if it might suddenly reveal something they had missed. One of the senior partners finally leaned forward, his voice carefully measured, offering an explanation that sounded rehearsed even as he spoke it, mentioning legal teams, external consultants, layers of review designed to ensure precision. But Daniel did not look at him, did not acknowledge the words, because he was still reading, still tracing that same paragraph with a focus that bordered on obsession. And when he finally lifted his head, there was no anger in his expression, only clarity. The kind that arrives too late to be comfortable. This clause transfers controlling interest after 6 months, he said quietly, not asking, not accusing, simply stating what was now undeniable. And this time no one attempted to interrupt, because the room understood what that meant, understood the scale of the oversight, the implications that would have unfolded slowly, quietly, until there was nothing left to reverse. A flicker of tension passed across the faces around the table, subtle but real, the first visible crack in the carefully maintained facade of control, and Daniel let the document fall closed with a soft, deliberate motion, as if ending something that had never truly begun. For a moment, he said nothing, allowing the weight of the realization to settle fully, and then he reached for his glass of water, taking a slow sip not out of thirst, but out of habit, the kind that steadies a mind already moving 3 steps ahead. When he set the glass down, his decision had already been made. "We are done here," he said, his tone even, final, leaving no space for negotiation, and the words carried more force than any raised voice could have, because they came from certainty, the same certainty that had built his reputation, now redirected to protect it. Chairs shifted, quiet murmurs began to form, but they never reached full volume, because no one wanted to be the first to challenge a man who had just proven, once again, that hesitation was sometimes the only thing standing between success and collapse. And yet, even as the meeting dissolved, even as assistants began gathering documents and executives forced composed exits, Daniel did not stand, he did not reach for his phone, he did not move to the next task waiting for him. Instead, he turned his head again, more deliberately this time, his gaze settling on Clara Whitmore as she placed a folded napkin beside an untouched plate, her movements as calm as they had been before, as if nothing in the room had changed at all. "You," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that it cut through the remaining noise, and for the first time, she paused, not startled, not nervous, simply still, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, and in that brief exchange, something unfamiliar passed between them. Not power, not authority, but recognition, the kind that does not come from titles or wealth, but from seeing and being seen in the same moment. Daniel studied her for a second longer than necessary, searching for something he could define, categorize, understand, but what he found instead was absence, no need for approval, no trace of fear, just quiet certainty, the same certainty that had stopped his pen mid-signature, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, less command, more curiosity. What exactly did you see? Clara did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she chose when to speak, and that choice, simple as it was, shifted the balance in a way no one else in the room fully understood. Clara let the silence breathe for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but precision, as if she understood that timing could shape the weight of words just as much as the words themselves. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying none of the urgency that filled the room moments before. The liability is not in the clause itself, she said, her eyes briefly lowering toward the contract still resting near Daniel's hand. It is in how it is framed. And she stepped closer, not into the spotlight, but just enough to be heard without raising her voice, her presence still composed, still controlled, as if this conversation existed on a different level from everything else that had just unfolded. Daniel did not interrupt, did not question. He simply listened, his posture shifting slightly forward, the smallest signal of attention that no one else in the room would have noticed, but to Clara, it was enough. The wording suggests protection, she continued, her tone even, almost instructional without ever sounding condescending. But it creates a delayed transfer condition that activates underperformance metrics that are intentionally vague. And as she spoke, her hand moved subtly, not touching the document, but indicating a section with the confidence of someone who did not need to double-check. 6 months is not a timeline. It is a trigger window, she added, and this time, a few of the remaining executives glanced at each other, their earlier composure replaced by something quieter, less certain. Daniel reached for the contract again, opening it to the exact page she had referenced, his eyes scanning the lines with renewed focus. But now he was not just reading. He was seeing, connecting the structure, the intent behind the language, the way the deal had been engineered to look balanced while quietly shifting control beneath the surface. And as that understanding settled, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not visibly to most, but enough to signal that the equation had been rewritten. And you saw this while serving water, he said, not dismissive, not sarcastic, but genuinely curious, as if trying to reconcile two realities that did not align. And Clara met his gaze without flinching, her answer simple, unembellished. I read patterns, she said. And there was no attempt to explain further, no effort to justify her observation with credentials or background, just a statement that carried its own quiet certainty. Around them, the room had shifted completely, the earlier noise replaced by a kind of attentive silence, not commanded, but earned, and even those who had dismissed her minutes ago now watched with a different expression, one that held something closer to respect than curiosity. Daniel closed the contract slowly, his fingers resting on the cover for a moment as if grounding the decision he had already made. And then he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a controlled rise that drew every eye in the room without effort. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same authority it always had, but now it was directed differently, not outward, but inward, recalibrated. You prevented a mistake, he said, his gaze still on Clara, and there was no hesitation in the acknowledgement, no reluctance, just truth, delivered as plainly as she had delivered hers. And for a brief second, something almost imperceptible passed between them, not gratitude, not obligation, but alignment, two people recognizing the same thing from opposite sides of the table. Clara gave a small nod, not in acceptance of praise, but in closure, as if the moment required no more than that, and she stepped back again, returning to her role without ceremony. But the room did not return with her, because once something is seen, it cannot be unseen, and Daniel Harrington, a man who had built his world on certainty, now understood that the most dangerous risk had not been the deal, but the assumption that he had already seen everything. The room did not return to its previous rhythm, even as people began to gather their things and step away from the table, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be reset with polite smiles or professional composure. And Daniel remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his attention still anchored to Clara Whitmore as she moved with the same quiet efficiency, clearing a glass, adjusting a chair, as if the conversation that had just unfolded carried no weight beyond its moment. But that was precisely what unsettled him, the absence of performance, the lack of any attempt to leverage what had just happened. "Wait," he said, not sharply, not as a command, but with a tone that suggested he was not accustomed to needing a second chance to ask. And Clara paused again, turning slightly, her expression unchanged, attentive but not expectant. Daniel stepped away from the table now, closing the distance between them with measured strides, his presence still carrying authority, but no longer dominating the space in the same way, as if he understood, instinctively, that whatever defined this interaction was not something he could control in the usual sense. "You said you read patterns," he continued, his voice lower, more focused. "That is not something people pick up by accident." And there was no accusation in the words, only curiosity sharpened by experience, the kind that had built fortunes and dismantled them just as quickly. Clara met his gaze for a brief moment, then glanced toward the window where the rain had softened into a steady rhythm, her answer coming without hesitation, but also without detail. "It is something you learn when you have to pay attention," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more depth than a longer explanation ever could. Daniel studied her, not looking for credentials now, not searching for confirmation, but observing the consistency in her tone, her posture, the way she chose her words carefully but never cautiously. And it occurred to him that whatever her past had been, it was not something she felt the need to prove. Around them, the last of the executives had begun to exit, their conversations muted, their confidence replaced by quiet recalculations, and for the first time since entering the room, Daniel was not thinking about them, not about the deal, not about the next move waiting on his schedule, but about the moment he had almost missed, the signature that had almost been written, the cost that would have followed not immediately, but inevitably. "How many others have you seen?" he asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could filter it, and Clara tilted her head slightly, considering, not the number, but the meaning behind it. "Enough," she replied, and there was no pride in the answer, no attempt to impress, just a quiet acknowledgement of experience. Daniel let out a slow breath, not in frustration, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a variable you did not account for proves more significant than anything you did. And then, almost as an afterthought, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a business card, holding it for a moment before offering it to her, not as a gesture of control, but as an invitation he was not entirely sure she would accept. "If you ever decide you want to use that skill somewhere, it is expected," he said, the pause subtle but intentional, as if he was aware that the word did not quite fit. "Call me." And Clara looked at the card, then back at him, her expression unchanged, the same calm, the same quiet distance, and after a brief second, she took it, not eagerly, not reluctantly, just simply, as if accepting it did not alter anything about who she was or what she would choose next. Daniel nodded once, a gesture that carried more respect than most words could have, and stepped back, giving her space not because he had to, but because he understood that whatever had just happened between them was not something that needed to be filled with more conversation. And as Clara returned to her work, blending once again into the background of the room, Daniel Harrington stood there for a moment longer, realizing that for all the deals he had closed, all the risks he had calculated, the most valuable insight he had encountered that night had come from someone who had never been meant to be part of the conversation. The rain had slowed to a quiet drizzle by the time Daniel Harrington stepped out of the private dining suite, but he did not leave the building, not immediately. Instead, he paused near the long hallway that overlooked the city, the glass stretching from floor to ceiling, reflecting a version of himself that looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, and yet felt distinctly different, as if something subtle but irreversible had shifted beneath the surface. And for a man who measured progress in numbers, in percentages, in outcomes that could be tracked and predicted, This kind of change was unfamiliar, intangible, and impossible to quantify. He loosened his tie slightly, not out of discomfort, but habit, a gesture that usually marked the end of a transaction, the closing of a chapter. But tonight there was no sense of closure, only a quiet loop in his mind replaying the same moment, the same voice, the same sentence delivered without effort or expectation. And what unsettled him was not that she had been right. It was how easily she had seen something that his entire team had overlooked. Behind him, the restaurant continued its rhythm, the low hum of conversations returning as new guests filled the space, unaware of the deal that had almost happened, unaware of the decision that had quietly changed direction. And somewhere within that movement, Clara Whitmore continued her shift, unchanged, unnoticed by most, but now impossible for him to ignore. He turned slightly, glancing back through the glass, his eyes scanning the room until they found her again, moving between tables with the same calm precision, her presence neither seeking attention nor avoiding it, simply existing within its own balance. And for the first time in years, Daniel found himself watching someone not for what they could offer him, but for what he could learn from them. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, and then, almost without deciding, he walked back inside, his steps measured but unhurried, weaving through the space with the quiet authority that still caused people to shift subtly as he passed, until he reached the edge of Clara's section, where she was placing a receipt on a table, her movements uninterrupted even as she became aware of him standing there. "You turned down the deal without hesitation," he said, not as a question, but as an observation directed as much at himself as at her. And Clara glanced up briefly, her expression neutral, thoughtful, as if considering the framing of his words rather than the content. "You paused," she replied simply, and the distinction settled between them, subtle but important, because it reframed the moment not as a decision, but as a choice to stop, to look again, to break momentum, and Daniel recognized the truth in it immediately. He nodded once more, to himself then to her, then added, "Most people would not have." And there was no pride in the statement, only acknowledgement of a pattern he had seen too many times, deals pushed forward by urgency, by pressure, by the illusion of inevitability. Clara adjusted a glass slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table before answering. "Most people are not listening when things feel certain," she said, her voice calm, not instructive, just precise, and the words lingered longer than they should have, because they did not challenge him. They clarified something he already knew but had not needed to confront. Daniel studied her again, not searching for answers now, but recognizing the consistency in everything she did, the way her attention remained grounded, the way her words never reached beyond what was necessary. And it became clear to him that whatever her past had been, it was built on discipline, not luck. "You said you learned to pay attention," he continued, his tone quieter now, less like a man conducting business and more like someone trying to understand a different way of thinking. "Most people learn to move faster." And Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not amused, but knowing, as if the difference between those two things was the entire point. "Speed hides mistakes," she said, and this time she looked at him directly, her eyes steady, clear. "Attention finds them." And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any complex strategy ever could. Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that did not signal frustration or relief, but realization, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to prove, only a shared understanding that had formed quietly, without negotiation, without agreement, simply by being recognized. And as Clara turned back to her work once more, leaving the conversation where it was, Daniel Harrington remained standing there just long enough to understand something he had not considered in years, that sometimes the most powerful move is not the one you make, but the one you stop yourself from making in time. The evening continued, but for Daniel Harrington, time no longer moved in the same straight line it always had. Instead it curved, looping back to moments he had already lived, replaying them with a clarity that felt sharper now than it had in real time. And as he finally made his way toward the exit, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant fading behind him, there was a part of him that resisted leaving, not because of unfinished business, but because something had started that did not fit into his usual definition of completion. Outside, the air was cooler, The rain reduced to a fine mist that softened the city lights into a quiet glow, and his driver stepped forward immediately, opening the rear door of the black sedan with practiced precision. But Daniel did not get in right away. He paused, one hand resting lightly on the door frame, his gaze drifting upward toward the skyline, as if searching for something that was not visible, something that could not be measured in stock prices or acquisition targets. "Office, sir?" the driver asked, already anticipating the answer. But Daniel did not respond immediately, and that hesitation alone was enough to signal that something had changed, because he was not a man who hesitated about where to go next. "No," he said finally, his voice calm, but different, less driven by urgency, more by consideration. "Home." And the word felt unfamiliar, not because he had never used it, but because he rarely meant it in the way it was meant to be understood. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city moved past him in blurred reflections, glass and light and motion blending into something abstract. And for once, Daniel did not reach for his phone, did not check messages, did not review the next deal waiting for his attention. Instead, he sat back, his mind returning, again and again, to the same quiet voice, the same steady presence that had interrupted not just a contract, but a pattern he had followed for years without question. He thought about the moment his pen had stopped, the fraction of a second where instinct had told him to continue, to sign, to trust the system that had always worked, and how easily that instinct could have carried him forward without pause. And what unsettled him was not the mistake itself, but how close he had come to missing it entirely. How dependent even someone like him could become on momentum when everything appeared certain. The car slowed at a red light, the soft glow reflecting across the interior, and Daniel leaned his head back slightly, closing his eyes for just a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to hold on to the clarity that had surfaced, the understanding that certainty was not always strength, that sometimes it was the thing that blinded you first. Somewhere across the city, Clara Whitmore was likely finishing her shift, moving through the same quiet routines, unchanged by the outcome of a deal she had never been meant to influence. And yet her presence lingered in a way that no negotiation ever had, not because she had proven something to him, but because she had revealed something about him, something he could not ignore now that he had seen it. When the car began moving again, Daniel opened his eyes, his expression composed as always, but beneath that composure was something new, not doubt, not uncertainty, but awareness, the kind that does not disrupt who you are, but refines it. And as the city stretched out ahead of him, vast and full of opportunities waiting to be seized, Daniel Harrington understood, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that the most valuable advantage he could carry forward was not speed, not confidence, but the willingness to stop when something did not feel right, even if everything else suggested he should keep going. The city had settled into its quiet midnight rhythm by the time Daniel Harrington stepped into his apartment, a space designed with the same precision and restraint that defined every other aspect of his life. Clean lines, muted tones, everything in its place, everything controlled. And yet tonight, the stillness felt different, not empty, but reflective, as if the silence itself was asking a question he had not yet answered. He set his keys down on the marble counter with a soft, deliberate motion, the sound echoing slightly in the open space. And for a moment he simply stood there, his eyes moving across the room without really seeing it, his mind still anchored somewhere else, somewhere between a signature that never happened and a voice that had quietly stopped it. Normally, this would be the moment he returned to routine, checking reports, reviewing projections, preparing for the next day before the current one had fully ended. But instead, he walked past his desk, past the screens that waited dark and untouched, and toward the window that overlooked the city, the same skyline he had seen countless times. But tonight it did not feel like a symbol of achievement. It felt like a map, full of paths, some visible, some hidden, all moving at different speeds. He slipped his jacket off slowly, placing it over the back of a chair, his movements unhurried, and then reached into the inside pocket, pulling out the same business card he had handed to Clara earlier. Except this one was his copy, identical, pristine, untouched, and he held it between his fingers for a moment, studying something that had always been so simple, a name, a number, a symbol of access, of control, of invitation. And for the first time, he wondered how often he had used it as a Shortcut, a way to move forward without truly looking. His phone buzzed on the counter behind him. A message likely waiting, a deal, a question, something urgent, something important, but he did not turn toward it. He let it buzz once, then stop, the silence returning without interruption. And in that quiet, his mind replayed not the mistake he had avoided, but the moment before it, the instant where everything had felt certain, where there had been no reason to pause. And yet something in him had, something small, almost invisible, but enough. He leaned his hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm, and exhaled slowly, not out of fatigue, but recognition, because what Clara had said, what she had shown, was not just about contracts or clauses or hidden liabilities. It was about attention, about the discipline to question even when everything appeared correct, especially then. He turned slightly, his gaze shifting back toward the room, toward the desk he had ignored, and for a brief second, he considered what would have happened if he had signed. Not the immediate loss, not the numbers, but the pattern, the continuation of a habit that rewarded speed over scrutiny, certainty over awareness, and how easily even success could become a blind spot if left unchecked. The phone buzzed again, more insistent this time, but still he did not move, because something more important had already taken place, something quieter, deeper, a recalibration that did not require action yet, only understanding. And as Daniel Harrington stood there, alone in a room built to reflect power, he realized that the most valuable shift of the night had not been the deal he walked away from, but the perspective he carried with him, a simple, almost invisible change that would alter every decision that followed, not by making him slower, but by making him aware of when slowing down mattered most. Morning arrived without announcement, just a gradual shift in light filtering through the glass walls of Daniel Harrington's apartment, soft at first, then steady, illuminating the same clean lines, the same controlled space. But something in the atmosphere felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because he had. And as he stood by the window with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, his thoughts were not on the schedule waiting for him, not on the meetings already lined up, but on a single, quiet presence that had interrupted more than just one decision. The city below was already in motion, cars moving in precise streams, people walking with purpose, everything accelerating into another day of transactions and outcomes. But Daniel did not move with it immediately. He remained still for a moment longer, allowing the clarity from the night before to settle into something more permanent, something that would not fade once the pace resumed. His phone rested on the counter, filled with notifications, messages marked urgent, opportunities that would normally command his attention without question. But today he reached for it differently, not with reflex, but with intent, scanning through each alert without the usual rush, reading more carefully, pausing where he might have skimmed, noticing details that would have once blended into the background. And for the first time in a long time, his decisions did not begin with speed, they began with attention. Hours later, the boardroom felt familiar, the polished table, the quiet confidence of executives presenting numbers and projections, the subtle expectation that everything would move forward as planned. And Daniel took his seat at the head of the table with the same composed presence. But his approach had shifted, almost imperceptibly, and as the presentation unfolded, he did not interrupt, did not dominate the conversation. He simply listened, his focus steady, his attention moving not just across the surface, but beneath it, looking for patterns, for gaps, for the small inconsistencies that often hid inside certainty. At one point, a projection was presented with confidence, the numbers aligning perfectly, the outcome described as inevitable, and the room waited for his approval, the same way it always had. But instead of nodding, instead of allowing momentum to carry the decision forward, Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze resting on the screen for a moment longer than expected, and then he asked a single question, not loud, not confrontational, just precise. Walk me through the assumptions behind that model. And the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, because the question did not challenge the result, it challenged the process. And in doing so, it changed the direction of the conversation entirely. Across the table, there was a brief pause, not of confusion, but of recalibration, and as the explanation began, Daniel listened without interruption, his attention steady, patient, And for those watching, there was something different in the way he held the moment, not rushing toward conclusion, but allowing clarity to form fully before moving forward. And somewhere, quietly, without acknowledgement, the influence of a voice from the night before carried into the room, not as a memory, but as a method, a way of seeing that no longer belonged to just one moment, but to everything that followed. Later that evening, as the city returned to its soft glow and the rhythm of the day slowed once again, Daniel found himself standing by the same window, the same skyline stretching out before him. But now there was a sense of alignment, not because everything was certain, but because he no longer needed it to be. And as he set his phone down, untouched for the first time in hours, a quiet understanding settled in, simple, almost invisible, but lasting. That the difference between success and failure is not always in the size of the decision, but in the moment you choose to stop, to look again, and to listen, even when everything around you is telling you not to.